Let's get going. So today we're talking about content, and given the last two sessions, let me just set the stage here a little bit. So we talked about product marketing, we talked about demand gen. Content is very intertwined with those things. So today there's going to be a lot of overlapping concepts. Some of it will be repetition, some of it will be a new take on the same concept as it relates to content. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind as I kind of go through things. But before I get started, I just want to talk about scheduling. So we have week 6 this week on content. Because of Thanksgiving and Christmas, we have been rejigging some of the weeks around just to make scheduling work and publishing work and everything else. So next week will be skipped. And then we have November 21st and 22nd is going to be on sales alignment and strategic growth. Then I believe it's a Tuesday, November 26th is on pricing. Then we have a 2-week break for Thanksgiving because we couldn't do it on a Thursday for pricing. And then we talk about M&A, and then we've moved up the people and org design and the budgeting and financial sessions to a week earlier, simply because there's some people going on Christmas break, and we just wanted to make sure that you guys got all the sessions before you went on your end of year break. So just want to make sure it's going to be a tight schedule. We have a ton of content coming your way, and it's going to be a lot to digest, but we'll do our best in office hours to get you as many resources. And if it's overwhelming or if you have follow-ups, please ping us by email and we'll try to get you additional resources to make sure you have the right help that you need. So that's scheduling stuff. The other stuff for housekeeping, there's a couple of new students this week. We had some new clients join over the last week, and they have some of their team members joining the course midway. So for you guys, you have access to all the sessions through the online course portal. If you haven't been able to get access, please let me know and we'll get you access. And in terms of how we run these sessions, please add your questions in the chat as we go as well. We'll make sure the recordings are available to you after the session. Please stay on mute until the Q&A. And during the Q&A, you can definitely unmute yourself. I actually encourage it that you ask the questions live. It leads to better conversation as well. But I'll do my best to go through the questions in the chat during the Q&A also. Okay, so with that said, let me jump right in. And if there are people that are waiting on the waiting room or there's some admin stuff, we have Gordon also on the call. He's going to be doing some administrative stuff in the live chat if you need. Okay, with that said, so I want to just, again, remind you guys, the goal of this program is to help you think like a C-level marketer. So we are not focusing on tactics. We're not talking about campaigns. We're not going into sub-functional areas like SEO and paid media at a very deep level. Our goal here in this program is to help you look at C-level marketing topics, interface with CEOs and boards, and really think about how to create enterprise value and revenue growth for your organizations. And content is one of those that's near and dear to my heart. I have a lean in terms of how I think about marketing. There's some people that, let's say, lean more towards events, some people that lean more towards paid media. I lean heavily towards content and thought leadership because I think it's one of the best ways to build a relationship with the market, because you're actually providing them value and on a consistent basis in a way that others are not. And so in terms of marketing strategy, it's like the third pillar, and it's how end users, customers, and prospects really encounter you. And content is not limited to what's on your website or email sequences or SEO. I think about content just shows up everywhere you interact with the customer, and what you're providing them with is a form of content. Even when you host an event, what is on your stage is a form of content. Who they meet at the event, how they network with each other is a form of content as well. And so it's like a three-legged stool that I think about. And we started with product marketing a couple of weeks ago, and we transitioned to demand gen. But both of these areas are only as good as the content that you produce. And if you kind of have weak content, as good as your strategy would be, or your positioning would be, or your messaging would be, it kind of falls apart if you don't have really good content assets. But on my side, because we've talked a lot about what great content looks like over the past couple of weeks, because it's so closely intertwined with these other two areas, what I really wanted to focus on today is how to prioritize the right content to focus on, just because there is so much content that you as marketing leaders are in charge of or need to produce or need to prioritize. And it's usually a big miss. But before I get there, just to kind of set the stage, is companies that get this triangle right, they have exceptional product marketing, which translates to the content that they produce, which shows up in the demand gen campaigns that they run. So as an example here, we have Wave Accounting. They're in the invoicing space and they work with a lot of smaller businesses and even freelancers. And you can see that they have exceptional messaging. This is right on their homepage. It translates to the content that they produce, which is, we talked about that framework of being more helpful beyond just what your core product does. And in this case, it's about cash flow and calculations associated with that for these small businesses. And then you can see that the demand gen kind of connects to all of this work as well. And it's about staying on top of your small business accounting. And this is a Facebook ad that they're running. Similarly, you have ChargeBee. The ChargeBee is actually a client of ours and been pioneering the whole subscription revenue space for a while. And on their side, it's about maximizing subscriber growth and retention and creating a ton of content and positioning around that. And you can see that translates to the types of guides that they create and the types of ads that they're running as well. What's interesting about this to me is if you were to look at a small company, if you just got these three pieces and you had them turning at a pretty good clip and you had a repeatable model, you can grow to become a pretty large business without doing anything else. And it just happens naturally over time because there's a bit of a flywheel, right? And I want to just kind of explain this is if you have great product marketing and messaging and you create a handful of assets and you're really good at distributing that through different channels, campaigns, and programs, you're inevitably going to find more customers. So in ChargeBee's case, they just need to keep producing more guides, keep running more ads. As customers come in, we've talked about the idea that you have good net revenue retention or good expansion revenue or good LTV from your customers. Those customers are inevitably going to grow over time. And so you just have to repeat that cycle and you can just keep growing as a company. And the same thing happens on the sales side. If you have good SDRs and AEs, if your SDRs are really good at calling and qualifying leads and your AEs are really good at closing those leads as they come in, then you just scale it by hiring more sales reps. So in this case, we're talking about more ad spend. In that case, we're talking about more sales reps. And so the question is, why doesn't that happen as much? And one of the reasons, and there's several reasons, but one of them is that content in general is used by the entire business. And to bring this to life even more, right? Like there's actually mathematical reasons why you could just keep scaling. Like if you put in $1 into your paid media spend and you actually had CAC payback periods of 12 months, net revenue retention of 110%, and an LTV of 7 years, every dollar that you invest today is going to be worth almost $9 in LTV by year 7. And in terms of enterprise value, that's what it's going to be worth if you sell the business at 5 times your revenue multiple. And by year 7, that $1 will have grown to $1.77 in revenue. So if you just make this $1 million, like you're at 1.7 on that revenue, right? And so why not keep the flywheel turning? And again, coming back, is the reason is that content teams are just spread thin. And the curse is that because there are so many competing priorities, you cannot just stay in this flywheel of great product marketing and messaging, great content creation, and great demand generation. And content playing a role across the customer journey is what leads to that complexity. And we talked about this last week of this idea that you want to work backwards from retention all the way through to discovery. And if you think about the work required, and we didn't talk much about this row, but I just want to bring your attention to this, is most of the work that sits inside all of these columns is content driven. It's or customer marketing content, it's product marketing content, it's sales enablement content, SEO, and the distribution side is almost the easy part. You can distribute through sending an email or posting something on social media or getting a sales rep to do it. But most of the work really is the content that you're creating to interface with those customers. And so even though on the discovery side, it might look like this, and you just want to repeat it, when you get down to revenue opportunity or priorities for the organization, you actually are responsible for all of this. And so it ends up being that whenever it comes time to prioritize which assets to create, you're unable to because there just are not enough resources. And if we step back and we kind of look at those 6 responsibilities that we have here, that's not all content is responsible for. Content is also responsible for driving authority in the marketplace, building a brand in the marketplace, and also general PR and comms work that needs to be done. Somebody has to do that work. And so we kind of get into this situation where even though we know what will drive revenue, you have these competing authorities that need to be done, and there's nobody else in the company that can really do them. The product team's not going to do it, the sales team's not going to do it. So inevitably it ends up on the content team's hands. And when I say content, it could be it's a product marketing team or sales enablement team, but anybody who's creating these assets ends up being ultimately responsible for that work as well. And we've covered a lot of frameworks in the last few weeks. And I want to just come back to some of these. Like, for example, this one that we talked about, which is starting with the highest leverage areas for the revenue that you can find and fixing those, and then finally working back up to traffic and leads. That's one. The second is, and actually we haven't talked about this yet, but just these buyer journey gaps that exist inside your funnel. It's like knowing at which stage of the journey does the client need what kind of help and what are their needs, and what content is required to help nurture them. So if you kind of look at it as like these three columns of awareness, knowledge, consideration, and interest level of hot, warm, cold, they're going to have different types of needs. So somebody on the bottom left might just need to answer a question, and someone in this middle right lane may want to just evaluate other options available to them in the marketplace. And so based on those needs, the type of content that's required to nurture them is very different as well. And this is just the front end of the funnel. There are needs across the rest of the funnel that we've looked at as well. And just like everything that we have explained or gone over in all of our sessions, the key is to work backwards across all these different sections of the buyer or customer journey. And so what ends up happening is like these are multiple frameworks that kind of overlap and they intersect, or there's a lot of commonality across them. But what ends up happening is on the content side, you have competing priorities. You have cross-department demands. You don't have enough budget. You may have demand gen targets. There are urgent deadlines. And at the same time, you don't have enough team members. And I've yet to meet a marketing team that has enough people or resources to create the kind of content they need to create. In general, they're almost always stretched thin. Even if they're a 150-person organization, they just have too many product lines, and the same problems still exist. And so the result is that across all these domains, even though we know what we need to work on, content doesn't have enough time or resourcing. And so it's viewed as a cost center more than a revenue generator. It ends up being quite reactive. There's no clear strategy, no framework for prioritization, and no mechanism for scaling impact. And we actually want the opposite of this. We want content to be as strategic as possible, to work on the highest leverage items, and work backwards to things that are not as revenue generating for the business. And that's how we will be perceived more strategic by the rest of the organization as well. And that's how we'll get more people and more budget to do the things that we want to do. And the biggest issue that marketers need to solve for is, how do we invest resources into the right thing? How do we prioritize the right items? And to this, what I'd say is the best proxy that we have is to compare content to a product organization. This is actually GitHub's public roadmap. Anybody can go access it. There's a bunch of companies that have public roadmaps, so it's actually super cool to go check out. But here you can see that they have spaced out all the different features that are in the pipeline, what's being worked on, which section of their platform it connects to, what's in the future, what's for Q1 25 versus Q1 24, Q3 24, which items have no status. And you can see they're kind of working through it. And if you were to go into this roadmap and click in, you would actually be able to see a lot more details for every single feature. And if this group has ever interacted with a product team, and if you've had an idea for your product team to develop for your software or platform, you may say, hey, I think we should develop X because it's going to help us drive more revenue, or I've heard customers want it. In general, or very rarely, will you hear that they will just take that feature and develop it today or starting tomorrow. And the reason is that they have a mechanism to prioritize, and the whole organization knows it, and items get added to the backlog. Then they have a system to figure out which one they want to start with. They have a strategy that corresponds to that prioritization mechanism. And then they choose what they're going to work on, and the rest of the organization knows that they're at capacity and other things cannot be added to the roadmap if the organization expects them to work on these items. This does not happen inside content teams. And that's what I want you guys to really change. And when I talk about the C-level concept here, it's less about creating an exceptional piece of content, there are plenty of resources that will teach you guys to create an amazing video ad or an amazing long form blog post and things like that. The C-level concept is to operate content like an exceptional product manager. You are the chief product officer of the content for the organization, and you must figure out how to make sure everybody in the organizations understands your prioritization mechanism and understands why the things that are a priority are a priority. And the best way to kind of encapsulate this is to build a consolidated content roadmap that looks like the product roadmap that we just looked at. And I would say there are 5 areas to or lenses to prioritize through. So number 1 are your strategic priorities. 2 is funnel inefficiency. 3 are the buyer journey gaps. 4th is the demand gen needs that you have. And 5 is the cross-functional demands inside the organization. And you need to take all of those inputs and you need to turn it into a consolidated roadmap. And coming back to one of the examples that we used a couple of weeks ago, looking at the strategic priorities of the business is usually where I would start first, because more than anything, in week 1 and week 2, we talked about understanding the business context and also uncovering your CEO and board expectations. There are conversations that have been had where people have looked at your financials, looked at your situation, and someone has decided we need to prioritize X amount of strategic initiatives above all else in order to meet our investment thesis or whatever our core business objectives might be. More than anything, you need to make sure that those are being delivered upon. So that's why I look at that as the first item. Even if there is an amazing content asset that you think will move the needle for the business, if you have not addressed those strategic priorities, most likely you will fail in your role. So as a stakeholder, it's going and getting full insight into what those strategic priorities would be, mapping out your revenue opportunities to those strategic initiatives, and then figuring out what kind of investment is required and what needs to be prioritized. This, I would also come back to basically in every area, whether we're talking about demand gen, budgeting and forecasting, the team that we need, you're going to see this slide a lot simply because that is the first domino where everything kind of falls after that. Another example of this, and another company who had its roadmap publicly available, is Atlassian. And you can see, this is kind of maybe a little bit hard to read on the screenshot, but you can see first 4 features have been released in Q1 of 23, Q1 of 24, Q4 of 2023. And these are all about general user availability and the ability to have more users inside Jira and Confluence, which are their 2 biggest platforms. And then you can see upcoming on their roadmap is the ability to have 150,000 users on a single site on Confluence, and the same thing for Jira, up to 100,000 users. So somewhere inside Atlassian, there's been a conversation about creating more and more enterprise solutions to sell to larger and larger companies so that you can have cross-department, cross-company adoption inside massive businesses, so that you're just on one instance of Jira and you can have full visibility into the organization. And so the product team is prioritizing that. And likely there's a plan to go to market to large accounts using these features when they are released. So in this case, because it's tied to such a close growth initiative, one of the best things you could do from a content perspective is figure out all the assets required to promote this feature, even if there are other ideas that might generate, let's say, 10,000 more visitors to your website in other ways, simply because the revenue that likely sits inside these accounts is probably north of $100 million. I would say a lot more if I was to actually understand their numbers. And so somebody has done that work. And you on the marketing side need to understand that and make sure the 5, 10, 20 assets required to promote this feature are actually being developed, and it takes resources. Another example of this is rebranding. So Atlassian bought Trello many years ago. I think it was almost a decade ago. Trello did not look like this, at least on their marketing site. But now it looks like it's part of one brand, one company, and it's uniform across all the other Atlassian properties. If you are part of an M&A platform and you have disjointed brands, even if they're growing, but there is a corporate priority somewhere to ensure that all of these companies sing from the same chorus, kind of, then it's a priority even if there's not revenue attached to the initiative, because kind of reskinning a site or creating a new design or relaunching a site is not going to drive more revenue for you. But if there's a corporate strategy in order to do that, you better make sure that that is part of your priority list and likely higher than other revenue initiatives. And we're going to come back to how you prioritize this versus other things. I imagine that will actually be one of the main questions that people ask is how do you choose between two equally good ideas across these different domains? And if you have questions related to that, just put it in the chat and we will definitely address that. Next, you want to look at funnel inefficiency. And depending on the problem area, and we've talked a little bit about this, but depending on the problem area, you need to focus your content production on different things. So if you have, let's say, a website traffic problem, likely you need to scale SEO content or social media content or paid social content, and that requires a different type of content production. If you have a traffic to demo rate issue, you got to improve your landing pages, you have UX and experience, maybe your technical SEO, maybe your mobile experience. If you have a demo to op issue, it's about better nurture programs and sequences and email campaigns and maybe even sales resources. And then finally, if you have an opt to close problem, most likely you have a sales tools and sales enablement problem that needs to be addressed. Depending on the step where you have issues, and as you pull up data across different stages of the funnel, and you can see conversion rates being too low in some areas and healthy in other areas, the areas where their conversion rates are too low require more content that needs to be prioritized. And this is something that we've looked at when we've talked about sales enablement and product marketing in general, is just looking at where are the gaps. If you find that sales close rates are too low, in this company's case, they just don't have enough resources for their top segments and verticals, like we've discussed in the past. So for your case, it might be different. It might be that the demos that are being held for your top accounts are not good quality. Maybe the reps that are holding the demos don't have the right follow-up sequences to go after those accounts. The answers can be very different. But the point is to figure out or diagnose where the gaps are and then prioritizing that type of content. I want to bring up a process here. Example called Procore is a leader in the construction management space. And I was looking at examples for case studies, and they have regular case studies as well. But what I found really interesting about this type of content is that instead of showcasing the client that used Procore and how they improved efficiencies and all of that stuff, they actually highlight the outcomes of people using their platform. So these are all the buildings that have been built by companies using Procore, and you can click in and learn more about it. So it kind of is a case study, but it's also a thought leadership piece, and it gives them credibility because of the top buildings that exist out there because of their platform. And for your case, that might be something different. Like, for example, I've written a couple of books, and the publishing company that we use that publishes the books, their case study page is not full of authors talking about how great they were to work with. They have those as well, but they list out the actual books themselves and of their authors and the results of those books or the positioning in the marketplace that the author was able to achieve by writing the books. And so for your case, what are those outcomes that you can be producing for your clients that you can be showcasing as well? For our business, one of the big things is when companies exit. That becomes a great example. We do use that in our sales decks. Another one is a new person was promoted into a role, or a new person was hired into a role, or a PE firm had a great outcome on selling a company based on the work that we did. And so that ends up becoming part of the language or the messaging that we have out there. Next, there's demand generation needs, and you need to prioritize content for those as well. And it's pretty similar to the funnel of inefficiency piece, but just coming back, I'd say it connects to this stage of the funnel where you have content, or you need to produce content for these stages where people are actually exploring a solution and you have potentially the antidote or the one of the alternatives that they can go with. And you need to make sure that across all the areas where you're encountering customers, do you have top-notch content that will actually convert them over to choosing you over other alternatives in the marketplace? And again, coming back to this framework, the product marketing piece needs to be intertwined into that, right? Just as an example, when we looked at Wave or Chargebee. And so for paid media, that could be short form videos, it could be content offers. For ABM, it could be verticalized case studies, it could be a ton of customized content for your top accounts, like one-to-one content, branded content. For free trial conversions, we're talking about in-product resources, maybe webinars, email sequences. And for SEO, maybe talking about long-form posts or videos on YouTube and things like that help you rank higher. Making sure that those are prioritized is also important. And so you can start to see, like, as we're kind of going down this list, like, we have the strategic priorities, then we have our funnel inefficiency, then we have the buyer journey gaps, then we have demand gen needs, and odds are your content team is less than 5 people, and there's only so many days in the week and quarter for you to get through all of this stuff. And we aren't even at the point of cross-functional demands, and this is an area where you're going to get pinged for other initiatives that are ongoing. So product releases a new feature, you have to create content for that. Engineering has a new integration, you need to create content for that. The help site needs a new article, somebody needs to produce that content as well. There might be a corporate news that comes out that you need to create content for, like the company just bought another business, or this M&A activity that you need to cover. So now you need to write a press release that needs to be out there. So there's just this ongoing business as usual work that takes up a ton of the content team's time. And there are just needs that are coming through all these other areas that you kind of need to prioritize. And as an example, Stripe just explained or announced a relationship with NVIDIA and how they're deepening their collaboration there. And there's no way Stripe cannot message about this because it has implications to all of their customers, especially the ones that are heavily investing into AI and thinking about Stripe and how it integrates into their product as they have those types of platforms out there. So some of it is unavoidable. So how do you prioritize that against all the other initiatives that we've just covered? And again, coming back to this framework of working backwards, I'd say you want to prioritize based on revenue. Revenue by far, or revenue potential by far, is the easiest path you have to be able to explain why something is a higher priority than others. If you were to go the route of like something that is on brand or something that is more aligned with overall messaging and positioning, that is a harder sell. So it's, if you can find a way to contextualize everything in the form of revenue in some way and attach some value to it, then you're able to have that consistent message or a way to compare apples to apples across very different initiatives. And we talked about this in week one, is really understanding your financial targets goes a long way, because that's a key part of the context that content teams need. And I would say when we talk about becoming a C-level marketer inside content teams, I would say 99.9% of people do not think about targets as the way to prioritize which assets are being created next. And so bringing that discipline and thinking about how much of your revenue needs to come from new customers, upsell or cross-sell, or expanding existing accounts by selling more seats, referrals, or what have you, reducing churn, whatever those areas are. If you understand that, then you can start to think about and connecting it to strategic priorities and everything else that's going on in the business. Then you can start to think about which assets are more important and working backwards from the number of closed won deals you need and which segments that revenue needs to come from, and then what content support is required to generate those targets in the first place. And the better your resourcing mechanism for content and the better it's understood internally, the more successful you'll be. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to randomly work on things where your team looks reactive and looks like it's just producing the next asset that's asked of it. Instead, you want to have a mechanism that everybody understands, everybody's bought into, you've communicated it to all of your key stakeholders, and that includes your CEO, maybe even includes your board, includes your CRO, includes your head of customer success, includes the head of support, includes even your CFO. The more those folks understand why you're choosing to work on the things that you're choosing to work on, the better they will perceive your work in this area and the more successful you will be. And what we really want is to have a proactive content team. So a proactive content team makes sure that the work that they're working on is aligned with overall business strategy, factors in revenue potential or impact to the organization, ensures that customer experience is maximized, and then also make sure that we're factoring in brand and brand value or brand presence or positioning in the marketplace and how all of that kind of factors in. And a simple way to kind of visualize this is if you were to scorecard different content initiatives, and this is a simplified version, but I wanted to give you guys a way to kind of think about this, is if you were to take those 4 things that we just talked about: strategic alignment, revenue potential, customer experience, and brand value, and then you were to take all your different content initiatives and you were to score them on a scale of 1 to 5 for each of these, and then you total up the score, it starts to become obvious what's important and what's not. So as an example, let's say this company has a list of Dream 100 accounts where they can launch one-to-one campaigns. it would have high strategic alignment, high revenue potential, high customer experience, maybe not as much of a brand building activity because it's very targeted in nature, but that gives us a score of 17. On the flip side, you have SEO assets where maybe it's not connected to any deep strategic initiative that's ongoing. Revenue potential might be longer term, 12 to 18 months. We don't even know how much exactly. Customer experience wise, like most companies don't really necessarily always buy based on an article they read on Google. And brand value wise, I give it a pretty low score here because SEO is not the main way to drive value, especially in enterprise B2B companies. And so in this case, you would have a score of 10. And you can see across the board, you have different scoring for all of these different campaigns that you can run. And at the end of it, you might find that your cross-sell campaign to existing customers is most valuable. Your ABM campaign is second, and maybe even paid social is super valuable. So out of everything else, and if you were to kind of have like let's say we had a drill down arrow here, and we were to list out all the 50 or 100 accounts inside this one, list out the 20 social videos that would be required here, list out the 5 cross-sell campaigns that need to be run, you could actually a similar score for each one. And it might turn out that out of the 100 accounts that you're going after on the ABM side, 10 really need to be prioritized more than others. And then you might be still able to work on 1 or 2 key SEO assets because they are important to the business. Maybe it's your homepage, maybe it's your main pricing page that needs to be optimized, and it still compares in terms of value versus the ABM campaigns that you're running. And so as you kind of do the scoring for every single piece of content you can create, the roadmap would become fairly obvious because you can just sort by total score or based on relative weighting that you give to each of these different criteria. And in general, what I would say, like as a secondary prioritization mechanism, or another way to kind of think about this is budget allocation, time allocation, or people allocation wise, about 50% of your time should go into maximizing total customer value. About 20% should go into increasing conversion rates, 15% into standard demand gen, and 10% into building brand or creating demand, if you will. And then finally, there are tactics like A/B testing and optimizing web pages and things like that. And this is just one example. This is not the be all end all rule for all companies, but at least it gives you some sort of an understanding of like, how would you allocate your resources and a way to communicate to companies like, hey, we have 3 people and we can produce this many assets and we're only going to give you X amount of time to promote new product features. So you tell me which 5 features this quarter are most important for us to write articles for. We will do those. The rest we're not going to do, or maybe we'll do like just a bulk release piece of content for all of those features together. And depending on your business and stage of maturity, how this distribution looks will be different. So this is something that I talk about a lot, which is a continuum of marketing maturity and where your business is on that continuum. Most B2B companies are between stage 2 and stage 4, where they're pretty sales led and the marketing impact is limited. And I think about it as based on the amount of marketing generated pipeline there is versus how much you're investing into marketing efforts. And it's a good way for you to kind of think about where your company is on that spectrum. Another way to kind of visualize that is by pipeline contribution and the size of team. And I'd say most companies have marketing pipeline contribution less than 25%. I'd say most are actually less than 15%. And so if you're north of that, that's actually really strong. If you're north of 50%, I would put you in a very sophisticated bucket, or say that you're more of a marketing-led organization in a transactional market. But in general, this is the filter. The team sizes can vary because let's say you're a $100 million company, obviously these numbers would look different, but the pipeline contribution is quite consistent. But based on the stage here or the type of maturity that you have, the distribution across those 5 areas looks different. So as an example, if we were launching a new company today, odds are most of our content should be focused on increasing conversion rates and standard demand gen work. When I say increasing conversion rates, I'm not necessarily saying optimizing your landing page. It could just mean that we're going to produce a ton of sales enablement content so that when we get a good fit demo, we're going to close that demo. You can see that as time goes on, the focus, or as you become more mature as a company, the amount of work required on increasing conversion rates decreases, or the amount of budget we're allocating to that. A sophisticated company could be investing as little as 20% of its resources into increasing conversion rates because they have good fundamentals in place. They have good CAC payback periods, good conversion rates from MQL to SQL, high win rates, high retention rates. So we're probably not going to spend as much time on this. On the flip side, we might spend a ton of time into maximizing customer value, which a new company may not do at all because they don't have that many customers to begin with, right? And even if you're in the middle set here, you're not going to get to about 50% because you just don't have enough customers. You need to optimize getting new customers in the door. And on the flip side, you look at things like tactics, they actually kind of become less relevant the larger you get because there's so much more revenue that sits inside your existing accounts that you could focus on. Whereas a company kind of in the middle stage, let's say 10 to 15 million in revenue, they haven't maximized standard demand gen work or optimize or all their different campaigns and programs and channels that would be fundamental for any company in a space. Like that could include Google Ads or retargeting or things that you can do on LinkedIn or SEO or basic nurture programs. Like a lot of these things are not at their maximum ceiling inside those companies. So you actually do want to spend more of an effort in those areas. And it kind of comes down over time as a company becomes more sophisticated. So depending on your context, you would lean one way or another very differently. And again, these are not hard and fast rules because it's possible to be a new go-to-market or be sales-led, but lean heavily into building brand because that feels like the best content lever to drive enterprise value for you. And give you an example of this, a company called Dream Data, partner of ours, we've referred clients to them in the past as well because data ops and reporting ends up becoming a pretty big area that most B2B companies need to work on. But they're still fairly small in the attribution space, if you will. But at the same time, they created this podcast called the Attributed Podcast, and it's actually a pretty good podcast. And they've had some really notable guests on there and that talk about all things marketing and attribution in particular. For a company of this size to create a podcast feels like, well, are we jumping the gun and going into thought leadership when we haven't yet maximized our product marketing work or sales enablement work? And in this case, I would argue that the thought leadership work actually does double duty for them. And the double duty is that it's thought leadership, but it's also product marketing work. It's also sales enablement work. In our case, like my book, Post-Acquisition Marketing, you would call it a thought leadership book, but I would argue that its primary purpose is that it is a product marketing book. We release that to release our methodology as a way to communicate to our ICP. Our goal isn't to become a New York Times bestseller. That would be a nice bonus. It's to become a book or a framework or a methodology that all PE investors use to think about in terms of scaling their marketing efforts for when they look at their businesses and then eventually come to us. And so depending on the type of business that you are, you might lean more heavily onto this creation demand side because you feel like it'll generate way more awareness and create more revenue for you. And on the flip side, you might also have a different way to prioritize based on your type of go-to-market. So if you're a more transactional company where it's like low ACV, sub $10,000, you may not focus on maximizing total customer value. You may put a ton of money and time and effort into spending as much as possible on Google Ads and being on top of everything and ranking for SEO and things like that. We talked about Trello earlier. Trello would be a great example of this. Trello's main playbook should be to focus on these two things as much as possible because they just want to meet as many businesses as possible that are paying them $10, $20, $50 a month, and they just want to scale with volume. On the flip side, if you're the Procore example and you're selling to enterprises and your deal sizes are 200,000, 300,000 plus, well, you are going to spend a lot more time on maximizing total customer value as well. So this is another way to kind of think about this is what percentage of your production is going to certain activities based on your size, your type of customer and ACV and your business context and everything else that's kind of going on. And as an example, this is another client of ours. It's called Litera, and they're huge in the legal space. And I believe in 2021 or 2022, they were one of the top three most acquisitive companies in North America, where they had bought like an insane number of companies at the same time. And you can see they actually have a thing that says all products A to Z. This is not even all their products. And so when we were coming in and we looked at their marketing strategy and their business, yes, front-end demand gen was work that we could do, but the number one opportunity strategically in a company that is so acquisitive is cross-sell and upsell and mapping out the white space across all the different law firms that they work with across all these different product lines. Because they had, let's say they had 100 law firms here and 200 law firms here. There's some overlap and not overlap in other areas, right? So cross-selling across geographies and segments became probably the number one lever for them. So again, in a situation like that, you would probably say that maximizing total customer value is like 70 to 80% of what the content team needs to focus on. And then also what we're doing from a product marketing and demand gen standpoint. And the idea is that at some point, the prioritization is a bit of more of an art than a science, right? Because I can give you all these numbers and give you these frameworks, but when you come back to your business and you look at your reality, it might be that your percentage breakdown looks very different than what I have on my screen. And so I would encourage you to use your judgment, but try to use these frameworks to have a more scientific way than you normally would. And that leads you to becoming a more of a proactive content organization and ends up creating a lot more customer value. And just to kind of expand on this point as a final thought is that three-legged stool, like a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, you can see all these ideas coming together, right? Where product marketing connected deeply to the TAM and segmentation and the customer and analysis and the positioning and messaging. On the demand gen side, we're talking about historical analysis and your go-to-market strategy and your program prioritization and your data ops infrastructure. And then on the content side, we're talking about buyer journey gaps and cross-functional needs and your strategic initiatives and demand creation and how much revenue is sitting inside those areas. So you kind of have to bridge all of these gaps and kind of think about them together. And you're going to have an extensive roadmap on content, an extensive roadmap on product marketing, an extensive roadmap on demand gen. But the more focus you can bring and narrow it down to 3 to 5 initiatives that all of these things can kind of collaborate on, the more success you're going to have. So with that said, I will stop the presentation.